Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are having a lovely Wednesday. I hope wherever you are in the world, it is also sunny as well. And if not, at least your afternoon is going to end on a high note with us to make sure you are in the right place. This is the fifth in our series of IRP, Integrated Resource Planning, trainings and information sessions. And our session today will be about reliability, seasonal planning, and reserve margin. And for many, you know, as Kevin would say, this is sort of the heart of the IRP. And so we've had some really engaging sessions leading up to this, and we hope today's session will follow suit as well. Just about a week ago, the IRP did come out, and so hopefully this adds a little bit more meat and color to the 1,500-page document that I'm sure everyone has read as their page turner for the evening and over the weekend. And so we have some exciting speakers today to give us some more cases and in-depth information so that we can see how this applies to us in the real world. And then we'll also, as usual, try to build in plenty of time for you to ask questions. So at any point during today, if you have questions, feel free to drop those in the chat box. And myself or some of my colleagues who are also helping to host this, we have Katie Southworth from Southface. Kevin Kelly is on board as well. And then we also have another Katie who I can't see on my screen, but I'm sure she's here from Boat Solar. They will all be around, as well as Spencer, helping us monitor the chat and field questions for our guest speakers. We ask that everyone try to remain on mute if at all possible, so we don't disturb those speaking. If you're having trouble at any moment, please message one of us in the chat and we'll try to see if we can help you. All of the materials for today, including today's recording, all get loaded to our Google Classroom, as well as you can find any of our past sessions there as well. And after the session is over today, we'll upload this one as well as things shared in the chat. Feel free to continue introducing yourself in the chat. Also share a little something that made you smile today, just so we get to know each other better. We will also at the end have a little bit of a survey so you can give us feedback so that we can continue to improve on these sessions. Our final session in the series will be next month. It will be on March 9th, same day of the week, a Wednesday, same time, 3:30 to 5. And so we hope you will join us for our final session as well. And information will be shared with anyone who is registered for this session about that, as well as posted to the classroom. So without further ado, I will go ahead and jump into our agenda for today and introduce our first speaker. And he will be here to provide some foundational information, an overview of reliability, TRM, as well as seasonal planning. And so we are very excited to have with us this afternoon, John Wilson. And he is here from Resource Insight. John is the research director, a well-known for Resource Insight, which is a well-known national consulting firm that specializes in the regulation of electric and natural gas utilities. Before joining Resource Insight, John served as the deputy director for regulatory policy for Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, where he worked for 12 years. John has testified in regulatory proceedings over dozens of times in 5 states and Canada. And so we thank John for bringing with him his wealth of experience and knowledge to share with us today. And I'll come back after John and introduce our second speaker, Daniel Cohen. So without further ado, I turn the floor over to John.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and great to be virtually back in Georgia. Nice to see a lot of familiar faces and names, and looking forward to getting this rolling here. So let me see if I can get my screen shared properly. Let's see what we do here. It did not share the way I wanted it to. Let me try this again.
It looks good on our screen, so I'm not sure.
It does look good? Okay, great, excellent. All right, good, great. So let me just jump into this then. So I'm going to start out by talking about the Southeast in general and what we mean by seasonal reliability And the first thing to sort of start with is kind of a foundation of how the Southeast is doing. And Maggie Schober and I, she's still at SACE, co-authored a report where we looked at electric demand in the Southeast. The data date through about 2018, 2019. So it's not 100% up to date, but it's still pretty relevant. And what we found was that overall, the Southeast is a dual peaking region. And so dual peaking means that you have basically a roughly equal chance of the Southeast experiencing peak demand in the summer or the winter. What's interesting about this is that, you know, several years ago, the Southeast was a summer peaking region. And what has happened, I think, is that over time, the effectiveness of building codes and other efficiency measures in the Southeast, which were primarily concentrated in the summer, brought down the summer peak. And as you can see, the winter peak remained flat. And so they've essentially converged. So when we talk about the Southeast being a dual peaking region, that may be considered a relatively new feature in the Southeast. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a couple of polls or quizzes during the presentation. And the first one is for everyone to grab hold of your poll option and answer the question as to whether Georgia Power is a summer, a winter, or a dual peaking utility. And so I'm going to give everybody a minute to answer that before I go on to the next slide, which will reveal the answer. All right, looks like we got 20. And about how many people do we have on the call? Do you know, Cicely, or on the meeting?
We have almost 40.
Almost 40. Okay, so I'll wait until we get up into the 30s. We're in the mid 20s right now. Okay, come on, a few more people. Maybe people are not paying full attention. I think I will close the poll in about 5 seconds here. All right, so we're closing the poll, and I'm going to share the results with you. So we had 64% said summer, a couple of people thought winter, and 28% thought dual peaking. And the answer, according to our report, is that Georgia Power has been a summer peaking utility. And we did this using 3 different measures. It's hard to sort of define what a summer peaking utility is. And I'm not going to get into the weeds on this too much, but basically we sort of looked at what is the maximum winter and summer peaks, and we looked at the ratio of those. So that was our first measure. As you can see, Georgia Power is kind of nestled down there in the bottom group, in the summer peaking group. And right next to it, of note, is Oglethorpe Power and MEAG. So a lot of the Georgia utilities are kind of clustered right there together. And you can see there we've done also some annual trends. So in the most recent group of years, Georgia Power eked out winter peak greater than summer peak. So that's one of the reasons we didn't just use one measure, because if we had just used this measure, it might have been sort of hard to decide. So we used another measure here, which is the number of hours that were summer peak, winter peak, or in between. And you can see there, Georgia Power had among the fewest winter peak hours over our full data set, right? Also, this is all ordered in the same order. So this is our kind of order of from most winter peaking to most summer peaking at the bottom. And then the third measure we used was one that looked at peak event distribution and the average duration of the events. And again, Georgia Power performed very similarly to a lot of the other summer peaking utilities. So, so that's kind of, let's see here, whoops. I guess I wasn't sharing the results before on the polls, just learning how this poll feature works, excuse me on that. Yeah, so that's kind of what I was hoping to accomplish there, is just kind of share with you kind of where Georgia Power is. And I think this is an issue that's coming up in the IRP, is sort of Georgia Power is positioning a lot of concern, as I understand, about its winter peaking performance. And this is just some historical context. It doesn't prove where they're going in the future, but it does kind of lay out the past pretty clearly, I think. The next poll, if we can move to that one, and I'm not sure if I can advance that, or I guess I advance it. There we go. We got the second poll up here. So I've given some reasons here for why a summer peaking utility might what reason they might give for being concerned about winter peak demand. And so everybody kind of take your best guess. There's 5 answers there, and see if you can read all of those. Some of them are a little long. You might have to stretch out your screen, your box a little bit, and take a guess and see which one seems to you to be the best reason on that list that they might give. I'm going to give it a couple of minutes here for everybody to answer. It's interesting watching the results come in as the answers switch from one to another. We got 21 answers in so far. A few more people still pondering this one. This is a little harder question than the last one. All right, I'm going to share the results with you. So there were a couple of answers that people liked here. And I'm going to go through each of them and talk a little bit about each of these themes here very quickly before I go on to the next slide. Only a couple of people thought solar energy might be a good reason for it. And at the level I gave there, 2%, that's really not enough to make a summer peaking utility be concerned about winter peak demand. That transition happens at about 15 or 20% of the utility's maximum generation capacity. And it varies a lot depending on where that utility is located, what its load looks like, what the power production from the solar plant looks like. It's going to be different for a utility that's located in North Dakota versus one that's located in California versus a long east-west system like TVA. So you're going to see a lot of different answers there, but 2% is very much too low. The next one here, natural gas infrastructure is at a high risk of failure during cold weather. And that, I think, is the best answer on this list. Those who picked that probably agreed with me the most. If you've got a lot of concerns about natural gas infrastructure and you've got a big presence of that on your system, then a utility might need to get extra capacity to back up that natural gas infrastructure. The next answer, the price of portable electric heaters is dropping. Electric heaters can be very relevant to winter peak demand, even on a summer peaking utility, but it's not likely that the price would be the factor. You know, we don't really see people going out and buying a lot more electric heaters just because those heaters are getting cheaper. But you know, if you've got a utility system, and this is particularly true with rural systems, not so much Georgia Power to that extent, with a lot of electric resistance heating, that will drive up the winter peak. Other nearby utilities have had problems meeting winter peak demand. This could be true if the other nearby utilities are very similar to yours, but what we see on our list over that's still showing up here on your screen is that a lot of nearby utilities can be winter peaking, but that doesn't mean that your utility is. So for example, you can see Alabama Power right next door to Georgia Power is in the dual peaking group. And you can look up at the top in the winter peaking group and see Power South and Santee Cooper, which are both adjacent to Georgia Power. They both share a border with Georgia Power. They're up there in the winter peaking group. So you can see that just being next door may not have a real effect on what's going on. It's the characteristics of the utility. And a lot of the winter peaking utilities tend to have a lot of rural customers. That's what we sort of took away from that list. It's not a definitive answer, but it's an indication. And then the final one was a bit of a red herring. Thermal plants actually perform better in the winter than in the summer. So I kind of tricked a few people there with that answer. But actually the fact that you have a lot of thermal plants on your system means that they are going to perform typically better in the winter, although not in the extreme conditions that you're going to hear about later about ERCOT. Okay, so I'll stop sharing there and move along in the presentation here. So it's important also to understand that what's going on in the electric utility world in terms of planning is that we are moving from very simple utility systems where there were just these ideas, these power plants, the transmission system and the distribution system, to very complex systems that involve a lot of different components. And I won't go through all of the little icons on here, but I can tell you that the level of expense and complexity in managing these systems is really intensifying. I'm involved in proceedings all across the country where we're seeing these investments being made, sometimes being made in a smart way, and sometimes utilities are just sort of throwing money at problems and hoping that something will work pretty well. So let's go to the next topic, resource adequacy. What is resource adequacy? And this is really, I put a definition here that you can read for yourself. And there's, and this graphic from the Energy Systems Integration Group report, which I highly commend anybody who wants to get into this topic in depth, is a good one that kind of shows all the different ideas around reliability. And resource adequacy is really focused on just kind of the generation and load side. But it's worth noting that most reliability issues actually occur outside of these highlighted boxes. So distribution reliability, operational reliability, those are areas where the utility often has problems that really don't fall into this resource adequacy concept. And we're going to talk a little bit about defining this resource adequacy term, but I'm just going to highlight here that it's often defined in terms of 1 day in 10 years of loss of load expectation. So that's kind of a phrase you're going to hear a lot of in this field. IRP elements. So we've got a whole bunch of key elements here, and I'm going to ask you in a second which one you think is the most important. And, you know, all of these are elements of the question of resource adequacy. So you need to have all of these pieces in place. Everything from the generation resources, including the retirement candidates, to distribution system in some utility IRPs. But certainly you want to understand your fuel cost forecast and your transmission system and those sorts of things. And you really also can't forget the connections with the neighboring utilities. And I'm going to come back to the importance of that in just a minute. So here's our poll on which IRP element do you think is the most important. And let's see, I guess I clicked this, relaunch poll. Wait, cancel. I want to go to question 3. Thank you, whoever's helping me out there. So here it is. Which IRP element do you think is most important? And I kind of just gave the answer away here. I want to see if anybody's going to, if somebody wants to argue. All right, you can put it in the chat if you think there is really one element that is most important. So whoever that person was, go ahead and do that. All right, I'm going to end the poll here because this one was just for fun. All right, so let's talk about how we determine resource adequacy. And here is what is called a stack model. This is one of the methods that is used. And I jokingly refer to this as resource adequacy planning for dummies, because you can literally do a stack model in a small Excel spreadsheet, or frankly, even in a PowerPoint slide. This is the stack model that was used by the California Public Utility Commission to justify purchasing over 1,000 megawatts of power. This is the entire model, literally, like right there on your screen. So when you hear that resource planning models are complicated, they are not referring to this kind of model. Now, California has a very comprehensive, complicated multi-step process. California has these things called load-serving entities, which are a whole bunch of different kinds of utility-type organizations that provide generation resources to their customers. I won't go into all the details of that. And then the modeling process also supports a separate entity that develops the transmission plan, CAISO. So there's a lot of different entities that get coordinated during this multi-year, multi-step process. And California was in a hurry. So basically the commission did a stack model. There was a lot of discussion about the details of how tall these bars should be and so forth. But eventually they basically just sort of said, yep, looks like we need some more power. And that was how they did it. So I've oversimplified it, but it is kind of a pretty simplistic process. The capacity expansion model is the conventional approach that is used by most utilities. And this is what Georgia Power calls its mixed study. And I've given a slide here from the Tennessee Valley Authority. I've been involved in IRPs in probably 7 or 8 states and in 1 Canadian province. So I've seen a lot of different methods and definitions used. The IRP basically is doing a optimization around the cost. So it is trying to say, how can we find the least expensive method to meet that planning, that resource adequacy objective? And we're going to go into what that objective is, but they're trying to solve for an inexpensive amount of capacity. The shortcomings of that are that there's a lot of correlated events, and then there's issues with chronological grid operation. So I wanted to just kind of highlight those, and in the last few slides here that I'm going to kind of power through, we'll talk a little bit about those. There are some emerging reforms coming out, and I'm not going to go into detail here, except again to encourage those of you who are interested in the details to read this report that you'll have the footnote in the slides. But there's a lot of challenges to modern to modeling resource adequacy in modern power systems, and you're going to run into this in the Georgia Power IRP. One of the things that's done in a standard capacity planning model is just you're sort of modeling each hour on its own, and you're trying to say, all right, what are the hours that have the most capacity need? And that doesn't really work. And so what point 2 is that chronological operations must be modeled. So you need to look at a week where you've got a very intense winter or summer peaking event, and make sure that you've got enough power to charge your battery and during the time that your battery is being charged up, and then it can discharge to meet your peak demand. So quick poll question here, and I'll just start this one and move on to the next slide. How do you think Georgia Power should balance complexity with transparency? So, again, if you wanted to do this really complex model, it would be too difficult to share with people. And if you wanted to do a very simple model, then everything can be accessible. So those are some balancing choices there. I wanted to finally come around to this point about relying on the neighbor utilities. And this is a really interesting feature in the Southeast. So as I mentioned, the Southeast is a dual peaking region, but each utility has its own characteristics. And you can see Georgia Power tends to coincide, its peak in the summer tends to coincide with the regional peak. And what that means is that Georgia Power has a harder time leaning on other utilities like Alabama Power or TVA to borrow power during its summer peak to help out. But in the winter, its coincidence is very weak, actually. And so it actually can lean on those utilities in the winter, because its winter peak occurs in different hours or maybe even on different days than the other utilities. Yeah, so I'm just going to keep going. I'm going to leave that poll question open a little bit longer. There's no right answer to that. I was just kind of curious what people are thinking, so I'll give that a second longer. So here's our definition of the reserve margin. And again, I'm not going to read through all of this, but the reserve margin basically says what is the amount of risk you're willing to take that you're going to have a power outage due to not enough power plants, compared to the risk that load will be that high. And so there's sort of this balancing approach there. And there's some key features you need to look for in that reserve margin determination. For instance, you need to make sure that it's set based on an average forecast. That's where you begin, is with the average forecast, not an extreme forecast. And then you look at the probabilities that the load will be higher or lower than that. And then there's 3 different measures that are used for that to determine how large that reserve margin should be. And I'm going to show you a little bit about that. So quickly, I'll share the results so you can get a sense of what people think. And looks like most people are weighing towards simpler is a little better, or maybe somewhere in the middle. Not too many people are really wanting the most sophisticated modeling. So for modeling geeks like me, that's a little disappointing, but totally understandable.
John, could you quickly say a little bit about uncertainty that requires a reserve margin, is it typical that the uncertainty has more to do with uncertainty of what the load will be, or is it more about uncertainty about whether the resources will be there when they need them?
Yeah, I'd say the answer is actually about 50-50. Load and resource availability under extreme conditions tend to create about the same amount of risk. It might be a little bit more on the load side in some systems, but I think it tends to be about 50-50 is my intuition. I haven't ever seen that quantified. So real quickly, because I know I'm probably coming up on my time here, or maybe even a little over it. I wanted to mention this measure, loss of load expectation. This is something that you will see in the Georgia Power IRP. And when you first hear it, you say, oh, 1 in 10 years, one event in 10 years. That's a pretty simple concept. Turns out that there's two completely different ways to interpret that. And without going into the math of this, it makes a big difference in the results. It can make a very large difference in what the reserve margin is. So even the definition of something as simple as one event in 10 years of loss of load is not actually firm. There's no specific national consensus on exactly what that means. And in fact, there's no basis that says 1 in 10 is the perfect ideal amount of risk that we should have. A good way to measure the ideal amount of risk is using something called an economically optimal reserve margin. And again, I'll let those who are interested read closely on this, but basically you're saying we have a cost to build more generation and have a higher amount of resources on the system, but there's also a cost to not having enough of those resources. And so when those two things are balanced, when you've got sort of the perfect balance between more and more investment and people's the risk of a loss being lower and lower, that's sort of your optimal point. But there's a lot of assumptions built into this calculation. So it's, again, it seems sort of like this, authoritative mathematical construct, but when you dig into it, they're just assumptions underneath it, or studies that have a lot of questions about them and qualifications. So any good witness can sort of dig into these and tell you a lot of challenges and perhaps places where there might be thumbs on the scale. So my final point that I wanted to share with you is just some of the issues in evaluating the reserve margin. Again, we saw that very high winter reserve margin from Georgia Power. And so you may be questioning, is that justified? The first thing is that ESIG, I've mentioned this report a couple of times, they really emphasize the use of multiple metrics for reliability. So you might want to have an expert really dig into expected unserved energy and figure out, is that being appropriately minimized with the metrics, with the results that they are coming to. The problem with expected unserved energy, however, is that it can overlook systems that have a risk of many brief outages. Winter risks on most systems tend to be rarer but larger, and that makes them much more challenging to model than summer risks. So you see a lot of utilities sort of putting their thumb on the scale against winter risks because they're just really nervous about them because of all the challenges with the data, understanding how people are using heating equipment in extreme circumstances, and really what is the trend on climate change? Do we know what that is with respect to extreme winter peak events? Those are questions that I have seen some utilities take on very directly and really struggle with, to be honest. Some others will just sort of brush them under the rug, but even those that are dealing with them are not finding really clear answers. And then finally, as batteries become more important on a lot of utility systems, those require really new modeling tools. The existing capacity expansion models really don't handle those very well. So I think I ran a couple of minutes over because I didn't quite anticipate how long the polling questions would take, but appreciate your patience with me. Thank you.
John, that was great. Thank you. We actually have a few minutes. Actually, you did well. We have a few minutes for questions, and some are in the chat. So maybe we'll start with, how does Georgia Power's target reserve margin summer and winter compare to other Southeast utilities?
So I'm afraid I don't have that number off the top of my head. The summer, a summer reserve margin of around 16% is pretty typical for the Southeast. I have not been tracking what's been going on with the winter reserve margins. And one of the tricky things about the winter reserve margin being 26% is that it's kind of calculated in a little bit of a different way than the summer, because resources perform differently in the winter than in the summer. I have not had time to really review Georgia Power's filing and compare it to others, so I really can't answer that, but I hope there'll be some great experts involved in the proceeding who will be able to answer those questions for you.
Great. And another audience member asked that he's read that extensive distributed resources, or DR, can help deal with high costs for reserve margin, or basically help with utility reserve resources. What's your view on the interplay between distributed energy resources and reserve margin?
Ooh, that's a complicated one. So let me think the best way to tackle that. I would say that it really varies. So for example, Tennessee Valley Authority is one of the utilities in the Southeast that is most at risk of having what we call a long duration winter peak event. And having a lot of distributed solar, even solar with storage on that system, would not necessarily be that helpful during a long duration winter peak event, because there's not enough solar to really recharge the batteries necessarily, and really keep things going over a long duration if you've got a lot of cloud cover, et cetera. So that would be a situation where a distributed energy resource would not help so much. Where it would help is in the event that a utility system has a resource shortage in one particular area of the grid and needs to shut down a certain portion of the grid. If you've got distributed resources, it may narrow down the area that they need to shut down and help keep most of the customers online. That would be a relatively rare event, but a pretty serious one that you'd want to deal with. Hopefully that gets at some of the aspects of that. There's probably a lot of other ways you could think about that question, though. I could talk about voltage variability and all kinds of other technical topics.
Thank you for that, John. We appreciate it. If you have other questions, I think John will still be around after his presentation. Continue to drop those in the chat box, and he can respond in the chat. I want to invite everyone to give John a virtual or likewise round of applause. We appreciate you for taking your time out this afternoon. And I also want to move forward introducing our next speaker as well. And so our next section will focus on talking about electric reliability across seasons, and we'll share some lessons for what we can learn from recent incidents in Texas. And so we have Daniel Cohen, who is here with us. He is an associate professor of civil and environmental engineering at Rice University. He is an author of over 50 peer-reviewed publications, and the book Confronting Climate Gridlock: How Diplomacy, Technology, and Policy Can Unlock a Clean Energy Future, which will be published by Yale University Press in March. Dr. Cohen worked for the Georgia Environmental Protection Division after completing his PhD at Georgia Tech and serving as a Fulbright Scholar in Australia. So welcome. And I will turn both our slides and virtual stage over to you. As with the last sections, if you have questions for our speaker, please drop them in the chat box. And Kevin, Katie, or myself will make sure that those make it through. And he'll also have some time at the end for questions. There you go, Daniel. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Cicely. Thank you, Kevin, for the invitation. It's good to be back virtually in Georgia, where I lived for about 7 years as a graduate student and then working there. And I would come over to Southface's it was monthly or every other month conversations that you used to have. So I don't know if those are still happening, but really enjoyed the conversations there. So good to be back with you. Yeah, I was surprised to get this invitation because I don't know how much lessons you can really take from Texas other than as a cautionary tale or what you don't want for your grid. So I added an "un" in parentheses to the reliability to the title that I was given. But of course, we've been in the news, and very interesting place to be studying electricity. A number of our published studies recently have been about the Texas electric grid, ranging from, in the upper left, you see the largest coal power plants in the country, to in the middle seeing the effects we had when that plant and other plants failed last February, and then the move towards wind and solar, where Texas is adding solar over these 2 years faster than any state has ever added it in any 2 years in US history, could pass California within a couple of years. So a lot going on. Given the short time, I'm just going to focus on 2 themes, the Texas grid and its vulnerabilities, including what happened last year, and then the transition to variable renewables that's happening quickly. So what makes Texas so challenging to ensure reliability on is the way we operate our grid as an island, a unique choice among the rest of the continental US and Canada. As many of you know, the Western US down to Baja California up to Western Canada is all connected. The Eastern US up into Canada is all connected. And then we've got this island that only has a couple of very slender DC ties to other grids. And so what happens in Texas stays in Texas, for better and unfortunately mostly for worse. It does get FERC out of our business and means that Texas has in-state control rather than submitting to some federal rules, but it restricts us both from being able to import power when we need it most, and means we can't sell much of our surplus wind or solar when it's very windy and sunny here. That could change a little bit. There's a proposal from Pattern Energy to build a couple gigawatts of connection to east. I think there's some talk about building connections to the north or west. But in a grid with 70 or 80 gigawatts of resources, even if these are built, it's probably 5 years away, and it's still going to leave us very disconnected. There was talk about reserve margins. So Texas operates its grid with lower reserve margins, at least in this 2020 example. It was relatively low reserve margins. You would think it would be the opposite, given that we don't have the flexibility of importing from other regions. This fluctuates year to year. And a slide that I added after what I sent Kevin, I realized I should point out this perspective is that even with that slim reserve margin, at least in terms of our summer peak, it's very old fleet that we're counting on to supply it. So about half of the thermal power plants in Texas are 30 years old or older, and about a third of our plants are more than 40 years old. So we're counting on a pretty old fleet to get us through the hottest and coldest times. This is the mix of what generated electricity. Natural gas is by far our leading source. It was just a couple of years ago that wind surpassed coal for the first time. And I think once we get the final 2021 numbers in, we'll see wind growing even more. Solar just was in there as this tiny share of the other. It was less than 1% until recently, but it's been growing fast. So in the bottom left, you see how wind has been growing incredibly, up around 30 gigawatts now, far, far more than any other state. Not the highest percentage. I think Iowa and some Midwest and Great Plains states are ahead of us, but nowhere else comes close in terms of total gigawatts on the grid. Solar, we were a real laggard. It took us till 2017 to get our first gigawatt. For a long time, we weren't even in the top 10 among states with solar. It made no sense that we were behind Massachusetts or New Jersey or much darker and smaller states, even on a total gigawatt basis. But once you double every year, you start to get to big numbers. So we hit 8 gigawatts last year and could be up at 30 gigawatts. Soon, there's, I think, on the order of 60, 70 gigawatts of projects lined up in the queue wanting to be built. So even if just a quarter of those get built, we'll have enormous amounts of solar on the grid. Pretty soon, battery storage is very small. It's gotten a lot of interest given the problems that we've had. About to hit its first gigawatts, could be at 5 gigawatts soon. So what went wrong? Given that background, what fell short? Well, we had demand was about 1/3 higher than the grid was able to provide. We had this collapse in generation. And the reasons for that, so supply was about 40% short of demand. At its worst, there's debate. Since the lights went out, blacked out homes can't tell us how much they would have wanted to use. ERCOT thinks it would have been 76. Andy Dessler's group at Texas A&M estimates 82 gigawatts, while the grid was only providing 40-something gigawatts of power. We couldn't import anything, so the green shows the imports, which you can't do when you're isolated. And then coal plants failed, so 40% of our coal plants were down, similar to how they failed in the 2011 freeze, how they failed in hurricanes. There's this idea that it's firm, reliable coal resources, but they failed us each time we've had a major event. Large numbers of wind turbines froze, iced. One of the 4 nuclear units went down because it had its water supply froze. And then the biggest shortfall was because 40% of our gas capacity was out. Mix of frozen equipment, gas supply chain that froze up, and that was the overwhelming thing. Officially, the official death toll is 246 people died due to impacts of the storm, mostly due to the blackouts. Some have put the estimate as more than 750 deaths, most of those from hypothermia and carbon monoxide poisonings. My wife, who is an emergency room pediatrician, had more CO poisoning she was dealing with than her entire career combined, including a few years in sub-Saharan Africa, where she hadn't seen conditions so bad. On a scale of how many people lost power for how long, it was over 500 times as much lost load as what California went through with its worst power outages that got triggered by the 2020 wildfires. So totally off the charts of how much lost power. This shows where the loss was. Again, natural gas was most of the shortfall, followed by coal and wind as the main things, and then that 1 nuclear reactor that was down totally swamps what other parts of the country would do. So this chart only goes up to 2018, but really nowhere else that had such a large portion of its population experience 3 days in a row of power outages in the coldest time of the year. So changing topics to where we might be headed in the future. I'm an atmospheric scientist, so I've studied the air pollution impacts of this, even back to my Georgia Tech and Georgia EPD days. And so we've estimated that the coal power plants that remain are responsible for several hundred deaths a year, mostly from the SO2 emissions that form ammonium sulfate particles, PM2.5. The ones I've blacked out have already been closed, but the ones that I've marked in red are both the deadliest that remain, and also, even for the benefit of all that pollution, they failed us in the recent freeze and during Hurricane Harvey as well. This is where those plants are scattered around the state. This just gives you a picture of how badly they performed. You would think it should just be a flat base load of output when you need the most. This is just the mess of up and down and flickering on and off. This is what we actually got from our coal plants. So we could replace them with wind and solar. This shows all the projects that are proposed as of 2020. There are even more projects than this now, but this is what we used for a paper that's waiting for final approval from the journal. Is you've got this big cluster of projects that want to be built where it's really windy and in West Texas and the Panhandle, and then this cluster of wind farms that want to be built. This is new proposals, not existing, but new proposals want to be built in South Texas, and that's where the existing wind farms are too, the South and this Western zone. Solar is being proposed all over the state. So this big cluster you see here in the Southeast, that's right around just southwest of Houston. It's not the sunniest part of the state, but because of transmission congestion, companies want to be close to load. And so we have a paper that is just waiting for final approval, where what we show is if you blend together wind and solar, solar from anywhere, but wind from different parts of the state, you can keep the lights on throughout the day and throughout the year. So they end up being very complementary. And so West Texas wind is the windiest. It's best at night. But then in summer, which is our main peaking season, apart from these freezes, West Texas wind does not give much output during the day, but South Texas gets the sea breezes that pick up in the evening. So with sun, you get good sunshine everywhere during the day. That can cover the day. You can have the South Texas coastal winds pick up to cover the evenings when our air conditioners are still humming, but the sun is set. And then West Texas wind comes on. And so we looked at a scenario of what if we only built a subset, about a third of the solar and wind projects that had already been proposed to be built in 2020. And we found that you could nearly mimic the output that we're getting from coal today. And the red versus black shows what the output would be if we The difference between them is what would happen if we completely replaced all the coal power plants in Texas with this subset of wind and solar that is selected for their ability to be complementary. The challenge in doing that is that it would move where we have the power. So the white black rimmed bars show where coal power is coming from. Is mostly from the east and north central and south central parts of the state. If we wanted to optimize for the best output of wind and solar, we would have it in the west of the state. So you're going to have transmission be built to be able to move this power around is the main bottleneck. But just in terms of being able to operate, yes, it's not always sunny, yes, it's not always windy, but together they cover all but a handful of hours of the year. So to conclude, our isolation gives us unique vulnerabilities. If we're going to run an isolated grid, there's probably no better place to run an isolated grid than Texas, just because we do have so much wind and solar resources and that can be complementary, at least but you need to diversify where your wind is located. Need to pair it with transmission, with storage, and with dispatchable resources. This can't do it even if on average they're complementary. Of course, we need the lights on throughout the year, and so we need a variety of resources to get us through those other times. And then for those who want a bigger picture, I know it's a narrow talk I'm giving today, but give a shameless plug for my book for those who want to look more or talk offline about the bigger picture of how we take this towards decarbonization nationally. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Daniel. That was great. I'm going to take a moderator's prerogative and put a couple questions to you that I'm curious to hear your response to. I think it's no surprise that I think people probably caught it in reading the early part of Georgia Power's IRP. There was a mention of something like, and the recent reliability developments in other parts of the country, code word. So what would you say to anyone that, raises the specter of Texas in the Georgia IRP? Is it bogus? Is it real? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends what lesson they're trying to take from us. I think we've made a unique mistake in isolating ourselves. We're losing money year round by not being able to sell our wind and solar. So that's a unique mistake. I think until this year, we hadn't been adequately maintaining our plants. It's still going to be old, 30, 40 plus year old plants that in last week's storm held up better. So I think the winterization really helped, but that could be a cautionary tale before. In terms of pointing to us to how big of a reserve margin do you need on a grid that is better connected, it's hard to know what lessons you get, other than I think just Texas being a buzzword or something to throw at things. So no one single answer to it, but just need to be careful about what lessons are taken and what shouldn't be emulated there.
So to add on to that, I think despite maybe the retrospective on what really happened in Texas, and I think early claims were this was all about the failure of renewables to perform. And I think some of the retrospective on what happened has maybe set that argument right, but to the extent that there will still be those who blame the failure of wind and solar and other renewable resources for what happened in ERCOT, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, well, I would just put back up, what I showed before is that we know what fell short, and the 15th, 16th was when we had the biggest outages. 16th was the toughest day. The dominant story was natural gas. If natural gas had performed like it was meant to, then everyone's lights would have stayed on. So that was the dominant story. But as I showed here, every single one of our sources fell short of what it was going to do. The wind turbines did ice. Somehow last week we had freezing rain. We had just below freezing conditions that are the worst for wind farms. ERCOT expected half of the capacity in that part of the state to go down, and they kept working beautifully. So we ended up having very cheap power unexpectedly, mainly because the wind far exceeded expectations. So yes, wind played a role. This green was what we were missing because wind farms iced, but I think there's a realization where I think we get the vulnerabilities of wind and solar, that it's a timing issue. It's getting them timed, and then dealing with the icing of wind that other parts of the country have de-icing, other parts of the country deal with it. I think there's a neglect of just how vulnerable gas and coal are, that coal with 40% failed during this storm, and that gas has that unique vulnerability that you need a constant supply at a regular high pressure all the time, that no other source needs a fuel to be brought across hundreds of miles at a very steady conditions. And when you don't winterize that gas supply system, it makes you vulnerable. So I think every fuel has its vulnerability, but I think we're fooling ourselves if we think that because it's coal, because it's gas, because it's something we burn, that it's inherently more reliable than the other resources.
Okay, I have a question from a participant, shifting a little bit to pick up on your comments about coal and premature deaths. So do you find that regulators are persuaded by estimates of the air quality and health impacts of coal plants and maybe single cycle petroleum peakers? Certainly Georgia has, a lot of those resources still around. They said your estimate of 178 deaths a year seems like a good reason to transition. What kind of response do you get to those observations?
Yeah, in Texas, it's frustrating. In Texas, most of our cities violate the ozone smog standards, but they meet the PM 2.5 standards. And so it's been an all ozone all the time focus. And so those plants that I've shown causing a lot of deaths from the PM 2.5 that mainly forms from their SO2, they've got some of the best nitrogen oxides controls in the world. And the focus has really not been on deaths, not been on health. The focus has been on getting EPA off our back and meeting the ozone smog standard. And so unfortunately, I think regulators have only been focused on what it takes to meet an ozone standard. And these deaths are from SO2 emissions that don't form ozone smog. And so regulators don't really want to hear about it. It was interesting that the EPA Science Advisory Board just came out with a recommendation of lowering the PM standard from 12 micrograms down to perhaps 10 or so. And Houston, Harlingen, and other parts of Texas and many parts of the country are in that 10 to 12 range. So I think if we start violating that standard and we have to have a PM attainment plan, when you have to write a SIP, a state implementation plan, that's what really gets regulators' attention. And I think that's what would finally get scrubbers installed, these plants that lack even 1980s vintage scrubbers.
All right, another person said that their perception is that we could best utilize renewables in the country if we could build, I'll say, more of a high voltage direct current grid infrastructure and get operators who agree to join in that. Any thoughts in terms of the benefits and maybe then the costs of building more high voltage direct current transmission?
Yeah, that's something I look at a lot in my book, talking to Chris Clack, people from NREL, from others. I think huge value to connecting across the seams. Study that came out showing enormous value. You can be much more cost effective with your wind and solar if you can move it around the country, if you could connect the west and east, and if you could connect ERCOT in. And so I think ERCOT not being connected is missing a lot of opportunities to use that Texas wind and solar to help others diversify. So yeah, I would love to see more within grid connections built, more cross grid ties, and the cross grid ties are definitely going to need to be high voltage DC to make that work.
Okay, I'm going to take a moment again for moderator privilege to just sneak in a question that I actually asked you earlier, but I happen maybe to be a lone, proponent perhaps, or somebody interested in the benefits of real-time pricing. And Texas had one of the few residential real-time pricing programs. I think people remember Gritty.com, right? And Gritty really took it on the chin in the ERCOT disaster. And so was what happened in Texas is that perhaps the death knell of residential RTP? How do you perceive what the fallout was related to residential RTP rates?
Right. Yeah, I think they made Gritty the scapegoat, and I think they threw out what was good about it when what was needed as a tweak. Is that I don't think residential customers should be exposed to prices that were allowed to get to $9,000 a megawatt hour. They were now they put the cap at 5,000, but anyway, our average is 30 or 40. And so I think you need some way, I think real-time pricing, a way that when I plug in my electric car, I have a reason to do it at times when wind and solar are abundant, when prices are low. If you could get those price signals through, but not expose people to the risk of, their bill being 50 times higher than they're used to, then I think you could get most of the benefits of getting us to adjust our use, getting us to have more responsive demand without those consumer protection concerns that I think gritty left people with bills they just couldn't pay.
All right, so final question, maybe a general one. Somebody said they appreciate their electric reliance service, but see the need to move from fossil fuel resources. So any general guidance to the folks as they go before the Public Service Commission, advocate the move away from fossil fuel resources toward cleaner resources, but run up against that, the arguments of reliability? Any recommendations to the group?
Right. Our fossil resources haven't been reliable. The failures we've had was in a grid where the seasonal plan for last winter was to rely on gas and coal for over 3/4 of peak winter supply, and they failed us. And to say it's because of wind or because of solar that 40% of coal plants went down, that 40% of our gas capacity went down. And this wasn't a one-time, we've seen it 2011, we see it in Harvey, we've seen it at other times. And so I think this, overwhelmingly fossil supply hasn't been serving us well in reliability, and a more diversified supply can be more reliable. We just have to do it right. We have to be sure we're complementary. We have to be sure we back it up with storage. We will need to keep, I think, some firm, the gas is in that role, something else can step into that gas role later, but we will need that for the transition. With good planning, a reliable grid doesn't have to be fossil heavy, but you just need to plan it right as we integrate more renewables onto the grid.
All right, well, with that, Daniel, thank you very much. If everybody can
Thanks,
maybe
Kevin.
give a round of applause to Daniel for that overview of Texas. And we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. And welcome back virtually to Georgia. And I'm going to turn it over to Katie Southworth, my colleague, who's going to lead the panel discussion on reliability solutions.
Well, I think that was a perfect layup for the next section of this workshop. We have a Shark Tank style panel. We're bringing the heat, got the big guns in. Spencer, I'm going to ask you to highlight our panelists. So we have 4 panelists today. We're going to ask them to give us a Shark Tank 2 to 3 minute pitch on their alternative solution. But first, let me introduce our panelists as they're getting highlighted. Our first panelist is Bruce Campbell, who is a principal with Campbell Energy Partners, which is a new role that Bruce is in after a 14-year stint as a Director of Regulatory Affairs at CPower, which is a national energy management and demand response provider. Bruce has over 40 years of experience in the electric industry and has been an active leader in RTOs and developing rules for markets participation. He was also a founding member of Advanced Energy Management Alliance, which is a leading trade industry group in the energy management and demand response space. After Bruce, we have John Kemp, who's with Avangrid Solar. Hey there, John. John started in solar development in 2008. He has held key positions at utility scale positions at Bosch Solar Americas, Hanwha Q Cells, Eon Climate Renewables, Silicon Ranch, and now he is with Avangrid. During his tenure at Eon, John developed a pipeline of over 2 gigawatts of utility scale solar, and his projects have been shortlisted to TVA RFP with over 200 megawatts, Alabama RFP over 80 megawatts, Georgia Power 400 megawatts, and there's a bunch of other projects I could mention, but really thrilled to have you here, John. So John's our utility scale expert. Then we have Danny Wagner with Advanced Energy Economy. He is a director that manages their regulatory work and engages regularly at utility commissions around the country on a range of rate making and utility business model issues. Prior to joining AEE, Danny worked on electricity policy issues at the White House Council on Environmental Quality and at Third Way, which is a think tank in DC. And last but not least, we have Jenny Chen, who I used to work for. who is a fellow at R Street, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy research organization that promotes free markets and limited effective government. Jenny's work focuses on energy policies that enable newer technologies, renewables, demand response, energy storage, to fairly compete against incumbent players. Jenny has worked for leading research and policy organizations, including Nicholas Institute at Duke University, Natural Resources Defense Council, where I had the honor of working with her, and at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So here goes, sharks. I have given them a prompt. They have 2 to 3 minutes to respond each with their solution. Here is the hypothetical that we pitched to you before the IRP was released, and now but this does relate to what we've actually seen in Georgia's subsequent to the release. So here is the prompt. Georgia Power has filed its 2022 IRP with a request to certify new natural gas capacity. Many clean energy and climate advocates want utilities to pursue cleaner, cost-effective alternatives to new natural gas capacity. Put yourselves in the shoes of such an advocate at the Georgia Public Service Commission. What is your preferred, cleaner, cost-effective approach to ensuring long-term reliability for the Georgia Power system, and what that the PSC should consider? Does it matter if the reliability need or resource adequacy need is in the summer or the winter? So first up is Bruce Campbell. Take it away, Bruce.
Thank you, Katie. I'm going to suggest that part of the solution here is demand response. What is demand response? Well, I'll go with demand response as an active response of customers to system conditions. And customers can range from large industrial loads that reduce production to big box stores, universities, water treatment facilities, and including down to residential customers that allow control of thermostats and hot water heaters. The vast majority of demand response today is offered as, quote, a reliability service, meaning that it's load reductions when loads are very high and traditional generation is fully dispatched. Most of my work has been in PJM in the Mid-Atlantic region, and PJM is a multi-state, multi-utility regional grid operator, similar to what ERCOT is in Texas, but connected. But PJM has a robust market for resources to support reliability. And by that, I mean any resource that can be used for reliability, demand response, generation, can compete to provide it at the least cost. And today in PJM, demand response is the 4th largest reliability resource type after nuclear, gas, and coal. PJM does not have as robust a wind and solar industry as ERCOT does and other regions do, but it will be growing. But at any rate, it's a big chunk. It accounts for about 7% of supply, almost 10,000 megawatts. So if Georgia Power had a similar contribution to demand response, there would be about 12 to 1,300 megawatts of demand response in Georgia Power. And as near as I could tell, Georgia Power plans for less than 250 megawatts. So, which is about a bit more than 1% of their total requirements. But this means that there may be the equivalent of 1,000 megawatt power plant available from demand response if Georgia Power and the commissions encourage it. And I'd note that in PJM, demand response competes directly with generation to provide reliability services, and it is compensated the same, which is to say that it's paid comparably to what generation costs for reliability service. So prices in PJM are a fraction the cost of new generation, but they're still a lot higher than what Georgia Power currently pays for demand response resources. So I'd recommend that Georgia Power seriously consider expanding its demand response programs, which should reduce and possibly eliminate the need for substantial new generation, and could accelerate retirement of older, dirty resources.
Thank you, Bruce. And I'll add that we will take questions at the end after all the panelists have given their pitches. If you want to do your own pitch too, raise your hand. There's time. Okay, thanks, Bruce. Up next, we've got John Kemp.
Well, obviously, you know, I'm probably going to say solar because that's what I do. I do wind as well, but there's not really a good resource in Georgia for that. So we typically don't do that down there. There's a really good resource for solar. A couple of things. Solar generates a local tax base. There is a standard Georgia tax abatement for solar. It's 80%. And sometimes in some of these smaller communities, that's the largest taxpayer in the county. So it really bodes well for the schools and the community to have that tax-paying entity there that's a non-service-based tax-paying entity. The other benefit would be it's a near-term solution. In other words, we can build a project. Well, the real hang-up is really the study grid. If that was quicker, we could build it quicker than that. But typically, that process between permitting and getting out of the queue is normally about 3 or 4 years in Georgia, where, PJM, Bruce, that's a lot longer there now. Solar and storage provide a capacity value. Right now, when you AC couple with the solar, the utilities can use that for a large variety of ancillary services, and not just have an energy asset. And from my experience in the last at least 2 or 3 RFP cycles, that's really been a preference of not only Georgia Power, but all the other Southern companies, TVA. They all want more than just an energy capacity asset. They want energy and storage as well. It is a capacity asset for both winter and solar, as we heard one of the other panelists discuss. Georgia is more of a solar peaking state. However, solar actually performs better in the winter because it doesn't lose a lot of its efficacy with heat. And then lastly, if we could get at some point a battery that could have an investment tax credit just on the AC side, you probably would see more battery that was just AC connected, like you see in Massachusetts, New York, California, etc., where the states offer a tolling agreement of some type for AC connected. That was in the Build Back Better. Obviously, we don't know if that's coming yet or not, but that would help as well. And that's my 2-minute elevator speech.
Thanks, John. I like your plug for Build Back Better. Okay, so we've got DR, we've got solar plus storage. Up next, we've got Danny.
All right, I'm going to build on top of what Bruce said. Bruce focused mainly on DR for commercial customers, through PJM and wholesale market values. I think that there's a lot that can be done to bring in residential customers. Commercial and industrial customers are they have more bandwidth to respond to price signals and to manage their energy and their costs. Residential customers typically don't think about their electric costs because they're on flat volumetric rates. So there are also other considerations about bringing in complex rates for residential customers. Some may not be able to respond. Some shouldn't have a complex rate forced on them. So my idea is to have a range of rates that increase in both the reward that they could get from responding to the price signal, as well as the risk if they didn't, right? So as their willingness to respond increases, they can go on a more complex rate. This will match those concerns about equity and residential, different types of residences and their ability to respond with the potential that is there, the unrealized potential and from demand response from residential customers. I do think that there's a significant amount of education that needs to be done for these customers. A lot of programs have not been successful because there hasn't been enough education and outreach. And you have to make this appealing based on their own motivations, whether it's cost, if you have good price signals, or emissions reductions, because emissions at peak are higher. The marginal emissions rates for plants are higher at peak. And so you have to appeal to the right motivation. I think another layer that's very important is the utility, right? Utilities don't usually make money off of demand response because they are avoiding capital that they make money on with a service that they pay for. They're going to either spend money on these programs, these rate design programs for education, et cetera. That's an expense, or they're going to pay people directly for demand response and their load reductions. And so that's an expense, and it replaces an opportunity to make money, and that really needs to be addressed in order to bring utilities on board. And utilities will need to be motivated in order to make these programs successful. So we really need to focus on those business motivations.
Thanks, Danny. So we've had DR, solar's low storage, innovative pricing and rates, the residential sector. And finally, we've got Jenny Chen.
Thanks, Katie. I love this idea of Shark Tank, but I'm not a very good shark, and I really love all of these ideas. So I'm just going to say that this isn't a competitive idea. It's something to add on. And this is something that I think resonates really well. Southerners do this really well. It's sharing resources with your neighbors. I grew up in South Carolina, and I was at Duke for a couple of years. So I know these things firsthand. One of you mentioned in the chat that Southern Company runs a centralized dispatch, and there is some amount of resource sharing. So there is a power pool run by Southern Company, and then there's an energy auction run by Southern Company, and now there is this new construct called the Southeast Energy Exchange. And the question is, how well do these constructs work? And does the Georgia PSC know about them? And does the IRP take these into account? So when we're talking about building new gas plants, do you really need to build your own gas plants? Can you share gas plants with your neighbors? What are the other Southern Company utilities proposing to their state PSCs? So these are all questions that I would bring to the Georgia PSC. And I know that Southern Company would say, well, look, we've already got a power pool, we've got the centralized dispatch. And I think some of the responses to those questions would be, well, how well is it working? How much are you actually trading? How much transmission is opening up? So when we look at RTOs, regional transmission organizations, and energy imbalance markets, we can see, for example, in Southwest Power Pool, their reserve requirement per utility is 12%. So not the 16 or 25% that you're seeing proposed here. And we know that ISO New England and the New York ISO, other RTOs, have reserve margins, in the higher teens, so maybe something more like 17%. And they're highly reliant on gas, and it's awfully cold up there. So I think there are ways that you can compare and contrast across the different regions, and take a look at how these different regions are performing, and with under greater resource sharing constructs like regional transmission organizations. A step down from a regional transmission organization would be something like an energy imbalance market. So we know that the Western energy imbalance market has reduced the amount of ramping required to integrate renewables by 50%. It's brought down costs, and it's also brought down emissions. There's a really great study by some academics, and I can drop this study into the chat, but it's also shown that regional transmission organizations have reduced carbon dioxide emissions over time and carbon dioxide emissions intensity over time faster than non-RTO regions. So Danny brought this up, vertically integrated utilities on a cost of service platform don't really like to, they would like to build more, build their own, and rate base that to customers. So if sharing resources means that you have to build less, then this is something that we have to work hard to convince the commissioners that that it's something that really needs to be done. And I think so some of the questions that you might want to ask would be, well, how well are the Southern Company's intercompany interchange contract, that's their power pool, how is that comparing? How is the energy auction comparing to RTOs and EIMs? So right before this this panel, I took a look at the Brattle report on the latest energy auction results from Southern Company, and there were no day-ahead energy exchanges cleared in that market, none whatsoever in the last year. of reporting. And on average, there were 16 to 17 transactions cleared on an hour head basis per month. So 16 to 17 transactions, and we've got 24 hours a day and 30 days to a month. That's not very much. And SEAM is also something that many people believe that will not yield as great of dividends as a more robust market construct. So I just wanted to add this additional option of a more robust market construct, sharing more with your neighbors. I just wanted to say transparency, accountability is incredibly important. Some of these RTOs and EIMs, you can just go to their websites, you can see the prices in real time, you can see what's moving where. And so having independent market monitors is so important, and helps us understand if resources are being put to their highest use. So I'll just stop there and let you get to questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. I think we could have a whole workshop just on markets or lack thereof, and lack of transparency. So I'm going to open it up to Kevin has collected some questions from the chat. If anyone else in the audience would like to pitch your solution, raise your hand so you can speak up if you've got a better idea. But I'll toss it to Kevin, who's been monitoring the chat, to put questions to our panelists, if you don't mind.
Maybe I will go ahead and say, Gary Garrett, I don't want to render your question for you. Would you unmute and go ahead and make your comment about your TVA experience?
Sure. I was just saying that many years ago when I was at TVA, we had a distributor air conditioning demand program that you actually received a small reduction in your bill for including an air conditioning cycling device on your air conditioning. And the program cycled your air conditioning off 15 minutes out of every hour. And you really didn't even notice any comfort level change. So, and it was an effective program to reduce the demand. It was a small program, but it turned out to be a fairly successful one. And now that I understand almost every meter in residential meter in Georgia is a smart meter, that type of program, and which may already be in the works, could be administered more effectively from the Georgia Power dispatch. Thanks.
Thanks. I have a question that I want to put to Bruce and Danny. DR is great, and what we see mostly is utility-led DR programs. And I'm wondering, in deregulated markets, what you see is some fairly successful DR aggregators working in the marketplace and delivering those, in some cases, selling them into the forward markets, capacity markets. Have you seen any of that type of DR aggregation work in a regulated market? Have utility commissions accepted or embraced that model of DR? Has it ever been part of, say, an RFP process in a regulated area for either commercial or residential DR aggregation?
Let me take that one on. And the answer is yes. There have been programs in various utilities. I know that with my former employer and the association, Advanced Energy Management Alliance was recommending what they called the Indiana model. And in Indiana, at least in Indiana, what they did is the commission allowed aggregators to bring demand response resources to the utility, and the utility would pay those aggregators for the value of those resources. And it's really, and I do think it's very important to make sure that value is based somehow on the alternate cost of generation. And certainly in the RTO markets where there are actual markets that we were buying and selling capacity, reliability capacity, as opposed to energy. That price is very transparent. There are also models that commissions can ask utilities to assemble that say, what is your cost for reliability capacity? And you can think of that as the cost of keeping some of those old oil-fired gas turbines in service for just a few hours at peak summer, maybe building new combustion turbines and extracting the energy benefit of that equipment. But there's a lot of ways to skin that. But yes, there are models at work that we have seen work in regulated utilities. The key is to pay those resources in a fair and comparable way.
So I think the main problem is price transparency in vertically integrated markets, because you don't have LMP and capacity that is priced very granularly, specific times, specific locations on the grid. And I see how that worked in Indiana, because Indiana is in PJM and MISO. But I wonder how it would work where there's no organized market at all, and the only information you can get on capacity costs is from the utility. So I think it would have to have a strong commission directive to come up with some sort of utility avoided cost on the supply side that was granular enough to provide a price signal for the demand response. And I think that's where the difficulty comes in. So it argues even more for better organized markets on the supply side.
Maybe with that, I could segue into a question. I know we're close to time. Jenny, you understand the South. You grew up here. What would you characterize as the primary objection, the primary hurdle to get over concerning establishing an RTO in the Southeast?
Yeah, I think, I've never heard Duke Energy or Southern Company say, we don't think that an RTO would reap greater benefits or savings. They might say, well, you know what, we got to take baby steps. We'd like to take things slowly. I would say my counter to that personally would be, okay, well, it's been 22 years since we started with RTOs, and in the year 2000, when Order 1000 came about, we have 2/3 of the country joining RTOs, and that was the year that Southern Company formed their power pool. So, and then recently we had more talk in the Southeast in terms of, okay, what are some of the incremental changes that we can get to increasing the transactions on the wholesale market. And North Carolina, South Carolina are looking at, are looking at studying joining an RTO. And then, and that's when we got the SEAM proposal. So there's a little bit of the, okay, we'll try to do this, but we want to do it our own way. And we want to take baby steps. And I would say that the counter to that is, what is the opportunity cost of these baby steps? It's been 20 years since 2/3 of the country has joined RTOs, and they've been reaping wholesale market savings. So that would be one. And what are the opportunity costs of not reducing emissions today? We know that these greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere stay for a long time. So we're losing out on some of these compounding effects. There are also a whole host of issues about how the utilities in the Southeast will say, well, look at our rates. They're lower than the rates in other parts of the country, but that's comparing apples and oranges, and there are actually a lot of counters that you can provide to that. So I can also point you to some resources to follow up on that if anyone's interested.
Thanks, Jenny. We did share resources in the Google Classroom prior to today's workshop, and we'll post some more. Thank you to all our sharks. We are all yes to all of the pitches. And so we really appreciate you taking the time. I'm going to turn it over to Cicely to do next steps. We have a survey that we're going to put into the chat. We want your feedback, want to make sure we're doing our job and getting you the content you need. Please do respond to that if you don't mind. Thanks.
Thank you all. As Katie said, we thank all of our speakers for today. We thank you for attending and hanging in here with us through 5 sessions. As I mentioned at the top of the hour, our 6th session will be next month. It will be on the same day of the week, same date, but just for March. And we're excited for that to be our final session. We're doing our best to make that session as interactive as possible. So for that to happen, we need you there to be a full participant. We'll be focusing on energy equity as a topic for that, as well as some other subject matters like biomass, and not sure if we're going to do transmission planning or not, but we'll definitely have some really good breakouts and interactive, and hopefully land the plane about how IRP and what it looks like from this point forward, and what it means in our respective worlds as we go forth with this over the season. We thank you again for joining us. All the materials for today will be loaded on the Google Classroom, so please look forward to notifications for that. If you've signed up, then you have already been added or will be added to the classroom. And if you have any issues, you can let one of us know. But on that note, I'll let everyone get back to their Wednesday afternoon, and thank you on behalf of my colleagues and team in planning this, and have a wonderful rest of the week, everyone.